We are coming close now to the Feast of Corpus Christi, or to give it its full title, the Solemnity of the Most Holy Body and Blood of Christ. It's one of these feasts that follow the Easter cycle and have something retrospective and reflective to them. In a sense, it's a replay of Maundy Thursday. On Maundy Thursday, we recall the institution of the Eucharist at the Last Supper by Jesus, but then that is overtaken by the dramatic events of Good Friday and Easter morning. And so now, in a quieter time, in green time, as it were, after Pentecost, out of the fullness of her love, the Church devotes a day to reflecting on the Eucharist, to giving thanks for the Eucharist. It's a paradox because the Eucharist itself is a thanksgiving, but we give thanks that we can give thanks in this way. We give thanks for this great gift, which is the Eucharist. I was pleased to read that King's College Choir at the University of Aberdeen has just produced a CD, and the title of the CD is O Sacrum Convivium. O Sacrum Convivium is the antiphon written by St. Thomas Aquinas for Vespers of the Feast of Corpus Christi. O sacred banquet in which Christ is received, the memory of his passion is recalled, the mind is filled with grace, and a pledge of future glory is given us. Clearly, one of the pieces on this CD will be a setting of that famous antiphon, which is a kind of condensation of the Eucharistic theology of the Church. What can one say about the Eucharist? It's not easy, really, because the Eucharist is something that we experience, something we believe in, yes, but it's something we experience. It's something that fills our life, and in some ways to stand back and to talk about it is not easy. It's rather a question of capturing what is this mysterious reality, this mystery of faith that's in the midst of the Church's life and, please God, in the midst of our own. Well, here's one thought. I am the living bread, says Jesus. There is something live about the Eucharist. Christ, the living one, is present. He is life-givingly present. This is his life-giving flesh. And he who eats me, he says, will live through me, from me, because of me. When you celebrate a Mass, imagine in a village, a weekday evening, there may only be a few people there, perhaps elderly people there, but it's not a dead thing. There's a life there. And what would the world be like without the Mass? The world, we know, it's a fraught place. But if there was no Mass in the world, if there was not this constant giving of thanks and receiving of blessing of God, the invocation of Christ upon the world that takes place through the Eucharist, what would the world be like? It's a terrible thing to contemplate. What would the Church be like without the Eucharist? An empty place. And without the Eucharist, we become empty people fairly quickly. I am the living bread, says Jesus. That's one thought, and then very much connected with it is another, of this idea of fullness. They were all filled at the feeding of the 5,000. That's the gospel for the coming feast in year C. They were all filled, they were satisfied, they all ate as much as they wanted. The whole liturgy of Corpus Christi has got this idea of repletion, of a banquet, of rich rich food, of overflowing wine, of nourishment, of fullness. It is so true that often perhaps it's people who are suffering and whose suffering has awakened a hunger in themselves who are the most devoted to the Eucharist, who come to it. I often notice that in a congregation, if you're celebrating with people whom you know well and you know their lives, you think, gosh, among these people there is suffering, and yet they come because they know they need this bread. We should, I think Hans Urs von Balthasar says somewhere, we should fall upon this bread like starving men in a desert. It's that important to us. People who have difficult situations at home, people in poverty, people living under oppressive regimes in dire social circumstances, people being persecuted. These are the people among whom the Eucharist has its full effect. So there's this wonderful fullness. We say, yes, this bread, this wine becomes the body, blood, soul and divinity of Christ, the whole Christ in his humanity and divinity. In the prayer after the consecration, there is recalled the passion and death of Christ, his resurrection and ascension, and in some of the Eucharistic prayers, his coming again in glory. In some of the Eastern prayers, his birth is recalled, his baptism is recalled. The whole life of Christ, the whole fullness, richness, density of who he is and what he has done for us is made present in this very humble, simple, accessible way under the forms of bread and wine at the holy table. So, may the Eucharist fill us. St. Paul warns against eating the body, drinking the blood unworthily. We must examine our consciences, and if there is grave sin there, we must, as it were, dissolve that in the waters of the sacrament of reconciliation, and then open our hearts to this fullness. The Eucharist is the great antidote to a bored and empty life, and it's the great assurance for us that Christ will come again, and as he remakes the bread and the wine in the Eucharist, so he will remake the whole cosmos.